Welcome to Introduction to Ecology, Lesson 17. Today we're going to talk a little bit more about competition, and then we'll discuss mutualism, which is sort of the opposite. It's different species helping each other. So back to competition. In the last class, we ended with the Lotka-Volterra competition model and the isoclines. And we discussed how you could find the species 1 and species 2 isoclines, and then we talked about the different ways that they could be combined. And qualitatively, there are 4 different ways that you can combine the 2 species isoclines. First, we can have the species 2 isocline lying entirely above the species 1 isocline. Second, we have the species 1 isocline lying entirely above the species 2 isocline. And then we can have crisscrossing figures. First, we can have the species 1 isocline above the species 2 isocline on the species 2 axis, and the species 2 isocline above the species 1 isocline on the species 1 axis. Or we can flip-flop that and have the species 2 isocline above the species 1 isocline on its own axis, and the species 1 isocline above the species 2 isocline on its own axis. There's really only those 4 different ways of combining the 2 isoclines. So today we're going to look at what that means, what those 4 different scenarios mean in terms of competition, and particularly in terms of those 2 ideas we learned about before, coexistence and competitive exclusion, the 2 broad qualitative outcomes of competition. All right, so what are we going to do? We're going to basically take an approach where we look at the isocline, we think about what that means, and then we think about how the population of the particular species should move, how it should change depending on where you are relative to the isocline. So remember, on the isocline, the population of that species, on the species 2 isocline, for example, the rate of change of the species 2 population is 0. And that's because you have exactly the right amount of species 2 to sort of perfectly balance with the amount of species 1 you have in that system. And so again, if you start with no species 1, then you can have the maximum amount of species 2, which is the carrying capacity, but as you add more and more and more species 1 to the system, you can fit less and less species 2 in. It just doesn't fit. Because again, they're sharing the same resource. And so that's how we think about an isocline. When we're on the isocline, the species 2 population is not changing, and that's because we have exactly the right amount of the species 2 population for the amount of species 1 we have, and so the 2 of them sort of just perfectly fit into the system. All right, so let's take a look at the species 2 isocline lying entirely above the species 1 isocline, and let's first start with the species 2 isocline. This is the species 2 isocline, so we need to think about the species 2 axis, and in this particular figure, the way I've drawn it, that's somewhat arbitrary, I've put the species 2 axis on the y-axis. So we're going to be thinking about the y-axis. We're going to be thinking about moving up and down along the y-axis, or the species 2 axis, because that tells us about the change going up and down in the species 2 population. All right, so remember, on the isocline, my abundance of species 2 is not changing. It should be constant forever and ever and ever as long as I hold species 1 constant. And so if I have more species 2 than that isocline, that means I have too much species 2. I can't fit that much species 2 in. There isn't room, there's not enough resources, and so I just have too much. On the other hand, if I am below the species 2 isocline, then I have too few species 2. I could actually fit more species 2 into that system. There's enough resources to fit a little bit more of species 2 in there. And so if I'm above and I have more species 2 than the system can support, you would expect my population of species 2 should decrease. I have too much, it should decrease. And again, we're thinking about the y-axis, so decreasing means moving down, vertically down. If I am below the species 2 isocline and I have less species 2 than the system can support, I could actually fit more species 2 in there, then I would expect my abundance of species 2 to increase. And again, we're thinking about the y-axis, that's the species 2 axis, and so increasing means moving up vertically along that y-axis. There we go. So that's what we would expect to happen to the species 2 population on either side of the species 2 isocline. Now, we don't talk about what happens to the species 1 population on either side of the species 2 isocline because species 1 is really only governed by the species 1 isocline. It doesn't matter what the species 2 isocline is doing. To understand species 1, we've got to think about the species 1 isocline. So right now we've answered all we can with the species 2 isocline. We've thought about how the species 2 population will change above its isocline and below its isocline. So now we're going to move on and we're going to look at the species 1 isocline. And the way I've drawn it, and again that's arbitrary, I have put species 1 along the x-axis. So now we're thinking about left and right. We're thinking about the x-axis. We're thinking about being higher on the x-axis or lower on the x-axis relative to the isocline. The same kind of thing, that isocline is where the rate of change of the species 1 population should be 0, where I shouldn't be increasing or decreasing in my species 1 population size. And that's because I have exactly the right amount of species 1 to use up whatever resources are left given that amount of species 2. And again, if I have no species 2, that's where I'm going to intersect my species 1 axis. That's where I can have my full carrying capacity of species 1. But then as I add more and more and more species 2, I can fit less and less species 1 in until I can't fit any species 1 at all. All right, so again, let's think about what happens on either side. When I am to the right of the species 1 isocline, I'm bigger along the x-axis or bigger along that species 1 axis. That means I have more species 1 than the system can support. On the other hand, when I am to the left of the isocline along that x-axis, along the species 1 axis, that means I have less species 1 than the system can support. I could actually support more species 1 in there for the amount of species 2 I've got. All right, so what's going to happen? Well, when I have more species 1 than the system can support, you would expect the species 1 population to decrease, and that's exactly what it does. Now, in this case, remember, we're thinking about the x-axis, we're thinking about moving left and right, so decreasing is moving to the left. When I have less species 1 than the system can support, you would expect the species 1 population to increase. I could actually fit more in there. It should sort of drift up. And again, we're thinking about the x-axis, and so increasing means moving to the right. That's exactly what happens. All right, so there are my 2 isoclines, and there are my sort of 2 vectors for how each of the 2 species populations is going to change. Now, if I want to think about how the combined system, how both species populations are going to change together in those different regions of the graph, I have to draw combined vectors. And for those of you who don't remember, when we add vectors together, we sort of draw the arrow that's in the middle between the 2. So if I do that, I get something like that. Now let me remove the 2 individual vectors. And this basically is a vector field. It shows you how if I start at any point on that surface, in that XY region, wherever I start, the system is going to move along those arrows. So if I start way up above the species 2 isocline, I'm going to move down until I get into that middle region, and then I'm going to start to move up, and I'm going to move all the way up until I reach the axis. Same thing as if I start down below that species 1 isocline, then I'm going to move up, I'm going to move toward that middle region, but once I reach that middle region, I'm going to sort of start to move up along that towards the species 2 axis. And ultimately what that does is it leads me to that point on that final point on the species 2 isocline, and that turns out to be, if you remember right, where the species 2 isocline intersects its own axis, that is the species 2 carrying capacity. And that means I have species 2 at its carrying capacity, species 1 is actually at 0. And that means species 1 is driven extinct. So this scenario predicts that we'll have competitive exclusion with species 2 winning out. All right, let's look at scenario number 2. Here we have the species 1 isocline lying entirely above the species 2 isocline. Same kind of deal, I'm going to look at each isocline individually, and I'm going to think about what that means for movement of that particular species population on either side of the isocline. So let's start with the species 2 isocline again, And I've still drawn that species 2 axis along the y-axis, so we're thinking about the y-axis, we're thinking about movement up and down. When I am above the species 2 isocline, I have more species 2 than the system can support. When we are below the species 2 isocline, I could actually fit more species 2 in that system. I have less species 2 than the system can support. So when I have too many species 2, the species 2 populations decrease. And again, decreasing when we're thinking about the species along the y-axis means moving up and down. It means moving down vertically. And when I have less of species 2, then you would expect the population to increase. And again, thinking about the vertical axis, we're thinking about moving up and down. We're thinking about moving vertically up when I am increasing the species 2 population. All right, those are my vectors for species 2. And again, we draw the vectors for species 2 using the species 2 isocline. Now we're going to think about species 1 and how the species 1 population should be changing. And in this case, we're going to use the species 1 isocline. So, as before, I have drawn species 1 along the x-axis. That's my abundance of species 1. And so I'm going to think about moving along the x-axis. I'm going to think about moving left and right. So when I am further right than the isocline, I have more species 1 than the system can support. But when I'm further left than the isocline, I actually have less of species 1 than the system can support. So when I have too much species 1, what's going to happen? The species 1 population will decrease. And decreasing in this case means moving left or right, and it actually means moving left, moving towards fewer species 1. When I have less species 1 than the system can support, I can actually fit more species 1 in there. And that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to increase the species 1 population. And again, in this case, we're thinking about the x-axis, so increasing means moving to the right. All right, there are my species 1 and species 2 vectors. But if I want to think about how the combined system is going to move, I need to draw the combination of those vectors. And we add vectors by sort of drawing an arrow in the middle. So we get something looking like that. And if I remove the individual species vectors, there's my vector field for the system. It tells you how, if I start at any point on that xy plane, how I'm going to move on that xy plane, how I'm going to move in terms of changes in species 1 and species 2 abundance. So if I start above the species 1 isocline, I'm going to move towards that middle region in between the isoclines, because that's how the arrows are pointing. And then I'm going to move sort of down along through that middle region to the species 1 axis. If I start below the species 1 isocline, or species 2 isocline, then I'm going to move up towards that middle region, right, because that's how the arrows are pointing. And then once I'm in the middle region, I'm going to move down towards the species 1 axis. And so ultimately that leads me to this point, which is the where the species 1 isocline intersects the species 1 axis. And of course, that happens where the species 1 population is at its carrying capacity. And where is the species 2 population? Well, the species 2 population is at 0. So in this case, we have species 1 at its carrying capacity, and species 2 is driven extinct. So again, we have competitive exclusion. But in this case, species 1 outcompeted species 2. We have all species 1 and no species 2. All right, now we're moving on to scenario number 3. So with scenario number 3, we have species 1, the species 1 isocline, lying above the species 2 isocline on the species 2 axis, and in our case that's the y-axis. And we have the species 2 isocline lying above the species 1 isocline on the species 1 axis. And in our case, that's the x-axis. All right, same kind of deal though. I'm going to look at each isocline separately, and I'm going to think about what happens to the abundance of that particular species on either side of its isocline. So starting with the species 2 isocline, as we did before, that means we're focusing on that y-axis. I've drawn species 2, the abundance of species 2 along the y-axis. All right, so again, the species 2 isocline is where you have exactly the right number of species 2 to fit in that system given a particular amount of species 1. And so the species 2 population doesn't change along that species 2 axis. But if I'm above the along that species 2 isocline, If I'm above the species 2 isocline, I have too many species 2. I have more species 2 than fit in the system, and so my species 2 population should decrease. If I'm below the species 2 isocline, then I have less species 2 than the system can support. I could fit more species 2 in, and so my species 2 population should increase. So again, above the isocline, along the y-axis, we're going to have species 2 decreasing, and below the isocline on the y-axis, we're going to have species 2 increasing. That's my species 2 isocline. Those are my arrows for my species 2 isocline. Now I'm going to think about species 1. And I'm going to think about species 1 using the species 1 isocline. And again, in this case, I've got species 1 along the x-axis, so when we're thinking about increasing or decreasing populations, we're thinking about moving left or right. So right along that species 1 isocline, that's where my species 1 population is not changing. It's not going up, it's not going down. That's where I have exactly the right amount of species 1 for a particular fixed amount of species 2. But if I'm to the right of that isocline, I have more species 1 than the system can support. And if I'm to the left of that isocline, I have less species 1 than the system can support. And so if I have too much species 1, what's going to happen? Well, I'm going to decrease the amount of species 1 I have. And decreasing means moving to the left, moving left along that x-axis towards smaller amounts of species 1. If I'm below and I have less species 1 than the system can support, I should be able to fit more species 1 in there. And that means I'm going to increase my species 1 population, and that means moving to the right. All right, there's my species 1 and my species 2 vectors. But again, I want to know how the combination of the two change. That tells me how the whole system changes simultaneously. And so to do that, I'm going to draw the combined vectors, and I do that by just sort of drawing that arrow in the middle. And there's my combined vectors. That's my vector field, showing how if I start at any point in that xy plane, how the system is going to move, how it's going to evolve on that xy plane in terms of the amount of species 1 and species 2 I have. So if I start above the both the species 2 and the species 1 isocline, I'm going to move in towards the 2 isoclines, and I'm going to cross one or the other. In this case, if I start pretty low down there, I'm going to cross the species 2 isocline, and from there I'm going to move up towards that middle point. If I start on the other side, if I start below both axes, both isoclines, below both the species 1 and species 2 isoclines, I'm going to move up until I cross one of the 2 isoclines. In this case, I've started pretty low on the y-axis, pretty low on the species 2 axis, and so I'm going to cross that species 1 isocline, and then I'm going to start moving up towards that middle point. If I start above the 2 isoclines again, but I start really high on the species 2 axis, really high on the y-axis, I'm again going to move until I move towards the 2 isoclines until I cross one of them, and then I'm actually going to move down towards that center point. Again, if I start at that particular point where I'm below both isoclines, but I'm quite a bit higher on the y-axis, I'm going to move until I cross one of the isoclines, and I'm going to move down towards that center point, and what you notice is that all the arrows point towards that center point. And so the system ultimately settles and stops moving at that center point. And notice that both of those 2 isoclines cross at that center point. And so at that center point, the species 1 population isn't changing because it's on the species 1 isocline, but the species 2 population isn't changing either because it's also on the species 2 isocline. So the system can sit there forever and ever and ever because the species 1 population shouldn't change and the species 2 population shouldn't change. Now what you'll notice is that this means that species 1 and species 2 coexist. There's some amount of species 1 and some amount of species 2, and it sits there forever and ever and ever and ever. But also notice that both species settle in at a point that is less than either of their respective carrying capacities. Remember, the species 1 isocline intersects the species 1 axis at the species 1 carrying capacity. So along the x-axis, that's the species 1 carrying capacity. And the species 2 isocline intersects the species 2 axis at the species 2 carrying capacity. So if you look at the y-axis, I've marked where the carrying capacity is for species 2. And then if you look at where that purple point is, it's lower on the x-axis than the species 1 carrying capacity, and it's lower on the y-axis than the species 2 carrying capacity. So neither species can be exactly at its carrying capacity. Each species population is a little bit smaller because the other population is there. In fact, it could be a lot smaller, or it could just be a little bit smaller. But regardless, both species suffer a little bit because the other species is present in the system. But they do coexist. Both occur together forever and ever and ever. All right, one more scenario. On to scenario 4. In scenario 4, the species 2 isocline lies above the species 1 isocline along that species 2 axis, and the species 1 isocline intersects the species 1 axis above the species 2 isocline. So again, the species 1 isocline lies above the species 2 isocline along that species 1 axis, along the x-axis. So same kind of deal. It's getting a bit repetitive now, but we're going to look at each isocline separately and think about how the abundance of that particular species moves relative to that isocline. So start with the species 2 isocline. And again, I've got species 2 along my y-axis. That's arbitrary, but that's how I've drawn it. And so I'm thinking about moving up and down. I'm thinking moving along the y-axis. So when I am above the species 2 isocline, I have more species 2 than the system can support. And when I am lower along the y-axis than the species 2 isocline, I have less species 2 than the system can support. So when I have too much species 2, my species 2 population should decrease. And when I have too little species 2, my species 2 population should increase. That's the movement of my species 2 population relative to the species 2 isocline. Now we're going to think about species 1. How is it moving? And to do that, we're going to look at the species 1 isocline. So there's the species 1 isocline, and I have plotted species 1 along the x-axis. So we're thinking about moving left and right because we're thinking about the x-axis. So when I am to the right of the species 1 isocline, I've got too much species 1. I've got more species 1 than the system can support for that amount of species 2. And so my species 1 population should decrease. When I have less species 1 than the system can support, that means I'm lying to the left of the species 1 isocline. That means I'm smaller along that x-axis. So when I have too much species 1, my species 1 population decreases, and that means moving to the left, moving along the x-axis to the left. And when I'm below, or sort of more to the left of the species 1 isocline, that means I have too little species 1, and my species 1 population should increase, and that means moving to the right along that x-axis. So there's my combined arrows and my 2 isoclines. And again, what I want to do is look at the combined vectors for how the system as a whole will move. So I add those vectors together. That means drawing arrows in the middle of them. And then I'm going to remove the 2 independent species vectors. And there's sort of the vectors for the whole system. And again, this shows you how the trajectories, how if I start at any point, if I start at any amount of species 1 and any abundance of species 2, right? Any abundance of species 1, any abundance of species 2 gives me a point on that XY plane. If I start there, it shows you how the system's going to move in terms of changes in species 1 and changes in species 2. And so if I start above both isoclines, but pretty low along that y-axis and pretty high along the x-axis, then I'm going to move until I cross one of the 2 isoclines. You can see the arrows point me in towards the isoclines. But then once I cross one of the 2 isoclines, and here I'm going to cross the species 1 isocline, I'm going to move down towards, in this case, the species 1 axis. If I again start low along species 2, but I start below both isoclines in this case, then again, the arrows point me up towards the isocline, so I move towards them until I cross one of the isoclines, and then the arrows point me down towards that species 1 axis. So in that case, I'm going to end up down there at that red point on the species 1 axis. And in that case, I have my species 1 population at the species 1 carrying capacity, and my species 2 population at 0. Species 2 has been driven extinct. That's competitive exclusion. But what happens if I start a little bit higher? If I start with more species 2 and less species 1, then again, I'm still going to be, sort of the arrows point me towards crossing those isoclines. I cross the isoclines, but oops, in this case, I crossed the species 2 isocline first. And now the arrows point me up towards the species 2 axis. Same kind of deal if I start with less species 1 and a little bit more species 2, but I'm below both isoclines, the arrows point me up. They point me up towards the isoclines. I move until I cross the isoclines, and then in this case I actually cross the species 1 isocline first, and I move up. That points me up towards the species 2 axis. And so in that case I drift towards that point. And that point is actually the species 2 population at its carrying capacity and species 1 at 0. Species 1 has been driven extinct. So I've got two different scenarios depending on where I start on that XY plane, depending on exactly where I start in terms of my abundance of species 1 and my abundance of species 2. If I generally have a lot of species 1 and only a little bit of species 2, I start down lower on the Y and higher on the X, I tend to drift towards species 1. But if I start with more species 2 and less species 1, then I tend to drift towards Y. So I start higher. If my initial point is higher on the Y and lower on the X, I actually can drift towards species 2 being the winner. What's going on? Well, this system is what we call bistable. So two things can happen, one or the other, depending on where you start. Your initial condition, where you start on that plane, where you start in terms of how much species 1 and species 2 you have, determines where you end up forever and ever and ever. So either species 1 ends up going to its carrying capacity and driving species 2 extinct, or species 2 ends up going to its carrying capacity and driving species 1 extinct. So in either case, we get competitive exclusion, but exactly who the winner is depends on your initial conditions, depends on whether you start with a ton of species 1 and very little of species 2, or a ton of species 2 and very little of species 1. It sort of depends on where you start, and that depends on where exactly you cross those isoclines, and then where you drift off, which axis you drift off towards, whether you drift towards the y-axis or towards the x-axis. All right, so there are 4 different scenarios, and you see we got competitive exclusion for the first, competitive exclusion for the second, competitive exclusion for the fourth, and coexistence for the third. So only one of these scenarios gives us coexistence. All the others give us competitive exclusion. So the 2 where the isoclines don't intersect give us competitive exclusion, but the winner differs. And the final one we did where the isoclines do intersect, that also gives us competitive exclusion with either species winning. The only case where we get coexistence is where the 2 isoclines intersect, but where the species 1 isocline lies above species 2 on the species 2 axis, and the species 2 isocline lies above the species 1 isocline on the species 1 axis. That's the only case we get coexistence. So that leads us to the coexistence requirement. So if I need the species 1 isocline above the species 2 isocline along the species 2 axis, and I need the species 2 isocline higher than the species 1 isocline along the species 1 axis, along the x-axis, then I can set up what my criteria are for coexistence. So remember, the species 1 isocline intersects the species 2 axis at N2 equals the carrying capacity of species 1 over alpha, and the species 2 isocline intersects the species 2 axis at its carrying capacity, right? If I have no species 1, then species 2 should be at my carrying capacity. If I have no species 1, then species 2 should be at its carrying capacity. So that's where that intersects. So if I need the red line, the species 1 isocline, to be higher than the blue line, the species 2 isocline, that means I need, that means I can put a particular relationship onto K1 relative to K2 and alpha. We're going to look at that relationship in a minute, but let's take a look at the other side. If down on the x-axis I need my species 2 isocline to lie above my species 1 isocline, well, my species 2 isocline intersects the species 1 axis at K2 over beta, and of course my species 1 isocline intersects its own axis, the species 1 axis, at the species 1 carrying capacity, and so again, that puts a restriction on what K1 has to be relative to K2 over beta. So let's look at that. If I take a look at my y-axis, if I take a look at my x-axis, first, I need K1, I need that place where the red line intersects the x-axis, that's K1, to be less than K2 over beta, which is where that blue line intersects the x-axis, right? I need K1, where the red line intersects the x-axis, to be less than K2 over beta, which is where the blue line intersects the x-axis. Now let's look at the y-axis. For this one to work out, I need K2, where the blue line intersects the y-axis, to be less than K1 over alpha, which is where the red line intersects the y-axis. Again, say that again because it's hard to keep straight. If I want that blue line to be lower than the red line on the y-axis, I need K2 to be less than K1 over alpha. So those are my two criteria. If I just sort of rearrange both so that I have K1 over K2 on one side, that gives me K1 over K2 has to be less than 1 over beta for the first equation. And it gives me K1 over K2 has to be greater than alpha for the second equation. And so if I combine those equations, now I have K1 over K2 being the same for both equations. That means that alpha has to be less than K1 over K2, which has to be less than 1 over beta. So let's think about what that means. Remember, alpha and beta are sort of how well species 1 substitutes for species 2 in terms of its competitive effect. So when alpha is 1, that means species 2 has about the same effect on species 1 as species 1 does. When alpha is much less than 1, that means that species 2 has a much smaller effect on species 1 than its own kind. So interspecific competition is less than intraspecific competition. When alpha is greater than 1, a lot bigger than 1, that means species 2 is having a really much bigger impact on species 1 than its own kind. So interspecific competition is much stronger than intraspecific competition. Same thing with beta. Remember, when beta equals 1, that means they're interchangeable. Species 1 is having the same effect on species 2 as its own kind is. But when beta is much smaller than 1, that means that species 1 is having a much smaller effect on species 2 than its own kind. Interspecific competition is much less than intraspecific competition. But when beta is really big, much, much bigger than 1, that means that species 1 is having a much bigger effect on species 2 than its own kind. Interspecific competition is much, much stronger than intraspecific competition. All right, so let's think about a case where interspecific competition is much, much stronger than intraspecific competition. In this case, alpha and beta should both be bigger, much bigger than 1. If interspecific competition for species 1 is stronger than intraspecific competition, and interspecific competition for species 2 is stronger than intraspecific competition, then both of those competition coefficients should be bigger than 1. So let's try 2. All right, if I put that in, what you'll see is I get 2 has to be less than K1 over K2, which has to be less than 1/2. Is 2 ever going to be less than 1/2? Is 2 ever going to be less than 0.5? No. So this is impossible, right? So it's impossible to get coexistence when interspecific competition is stronger than intraspecific competition for both species. It just doesn't work out. Now let's take a look at when both competition coefficients are less than 1. So in this case, for both species, interspecific competition is weaker than intraspecific competition. It's, fighting with things that are not your species is less detrimental to you than fighting with things that are your own species, right? That means alpha and beta for both species have to be less than 1 if that's true for both species. In that case, 0.5 has to be less than K1 over K2, which has to be less than 2. So we can make that violated. We can violate that depending on how we pick K1 and K2, right? So it's possible that this won't work out, but we can make it work out. At the very least, if K1 and K2 are, the right size, if relative carrying capacities of the two species are correct, we can make this a true statement because 0.5 is less than 2. It's possible to make this a true statement. And so coexistence is possible depending on the carrying capacities of the two species, but it's at least possible when interspecific competition is weaker than intraspecific competition for both species. And so this leads us to this idea. It's a hand-wavy idea. It's a little bit, there's more subtleties to this, there's more complexities, but coexistence occurs when both species limit themselves more than they limit each other. And you'll hear a lot of ecologists say this. Coexistence is only possible when both species limit themselves more than they limit the other one. So what is true for both species, that interspecific competition is weaker than intraspecific competition, right? Or intraspecific competition is greater than interspecific competition. When both alpha and beta are less than 1, that's what you require for coexistence, right? That's not entirely true. Let's take a look at this scenario. So here we have alpha is 2, so that means that interspecific competition is really bad, it's really strong for species 1, right, because alpha is in the species 1 equation. But interspecific competition is really, really, really weak for species 2, because beta is much less than 1. So if I do that, I plug those in, then I get 2 has to be less than k1 over k2, which has to be less than 10. So it is possible to satisfy this for the right combination of k1 and k2 because 2 is less than 10. But what it took was coexistence. So coexistence is possible because we can satisfy that equation, but what it took is having beta really, really small to sort of compensate for alpha being big. So when interspecific competition is really strong on the one species, we need it to be really weak on the other species to have coexistence, and we need to pick our carrying capacities correctly. So again, it's possible, but we're going to have K1 significantly bigger than K2, right? We can't have, there's no way that K1 can be less than K2. That ratio has to be bigger than 2. And so it's only possible when beta is really weak and the ratio of carrying capacities is such that K1 is really big. That's the only way we can have interspecific competition stronger on species 1 than intraspecific competition and still have coexistence. We basically need species 1 to have a really big carrying capacity, and we need species 2 to have a really small carrying capacity, and that kind of compensates for this strong interspecific competition on species 1. But again, we also need interspecific competition on species 2 to be weak to sort of balance out that really small carrying capacity. So it's harder to make it happen, but you can get coexistence even when one of the two species faces strong interspecific competition. Not when both of them do, but when one of them does. All right, we can do the same kind of thing. We can look at, well, what happens when interspecific competition on species 1 is really weak, but interspecific competition is stronger than intraspecific competition on species 2. So in that case, alpha is much less than 1, but beta is bigger than 1. And so in that case, we get 0.1 has to be less than k1 over k2, which has to be less than 0.5. So is that possible? It's possible because I can find some ratio of carrying capacities. The point is that 0.1 is less than 0.5, and so it's at least possible to satisfy this equation with the right carrying capacities. But again, notice I need to keep that k1 over k2 ratio less than 0.5, and so k2 must be significantly bigger than k1. Right? And that means I'm sort of balancing out that strong interspecific competition on species 2, that beta much bigger than 1. I'm balancing that out by having a large species 2 carrying capacity, right? It's facing strong interspecific competition, but it's got a huge carrying capacity relative to species 1. And then species 1 has to have this tiny carrying capacity. And also, because it has this tiny carrying capacity, you have to have pretty weak interspecific competition on species 1. So again, you can have coexistence when one of the two species faces stronger interspecific competition than intraspecific competition. It's much easier to get coexistence when both face interspecific competition that is weaker than intraspecific competition. But you can at least do it if one of the two faces strong interspecific competition. But it's harder to do. It's more of a balancing act. The carrying capacities have to be sort of much more distinct. So again, that idea that coexistence requires that both species limit themselves more than they limit each other, that's sort of a bit of an oversimplification. It's a bit more complicated. You can have scenarios where intraspecific competition is stronger, interspecific competition is stronger on one species than the other. However, again, it's harder to get coexistence in those scenarios, but you can do it. It is possible. All right, so now what we're going to do is we're going to do some example problems, and we're going to figure out what's going on with two species that are competing based on their competition coefficients and their carrying capacities. We're going to figure out whether we're going to get coexistence or whether we're going to get one species winning, and if one species wins, then which species is going to be the winner. So that was the first example problem. I would strongly suggest that you practice this yourself if you're not in class or if you're rewatching. If you don't know how to do it, ask a friend for their notes or talk to me. Here's a second example, a little bit different. Here we're looking at a particular figure of isoclines, and we're trying to figure out different carrying capacities, and we're trying to, again, figure out what's going to happen, which of these two different species, the green frogs, the bullfrogs, are going to win out, or are they going to coexist? So again, if you don't know how to do this problem, if you're struggling, get notes from a friend or talk to me. All right, so that's the end of competition. Now we're going to move on to mutualism, which is basically the opposite. With competition, we had species hurting each other. And in fact, with predation, we had at least one species being a loser. With competition, both species kind of suffer, right? Even if they coexist, then they do so at lower than their carrying capacities because the other is stealing resources. With predation, one species suffers, one species benefits. With mutualism, we have both species benefiting. Not so much with commensalism, you'll see that in a minute, but with mutualism, both species benefit. All right, so again, mutualism is defined as any mutually beneficial interactions between individuals of two or more species. So it's a positive relation for both interacting parties. And this is just one example. I have an oxbird on a zebra. What oxbirds do is they sit on the zebra and they eat the flies that come to sort of munch on the zebra. And so why is that beneficial for both animals? Well, the oxbird is basically getting food, right? And the zebra is getting protected from these biting flies that are sucking its energy and spreading disease. So that's good for both parties. So I said mutualism is beneficial for both. Commensalism is sort of an analogous thing to amensalism. Remember, we learned in amensalism it's where you have sort of one species that's not hurt, but the other species that is. But in this case, commensalism is where we have one species really benefiting, whereas the other one is not harmed. It's sort of a +0 relationship. One does really well, one doesn't care that the other's there. And so here again we have birds on an animal's back, but this is an example of commensalism. These are egrets, and what these egrets do is as the animals move through the grass, they stir up inverts and things that the egrets will eat, and the egrets pick them out of the grass. So they're sitting on those animals not so much because they're picking food off of the animal directly. They're not protecting the animal from flies. All they're doing is sitting on the animal. That doesn't really hurt the elephant much. But then they're sort of, as the elephant moves through the grass, they're picking off the invertebrates, the insects and other stuff that the elephants scatter. So again, that's commensalism because the elephants aren't benefiting. The egrets are benefiting, but the elephants also aren't hurting. So it's a +0 relationship. So together, both mutualism and commensalism, when we want to talk about them using a unified term, we call that facilitation. So both mutualism and commensalism are facilitation. All right, so you might have heard of, positive interactions between species as being called symbioses. And that's true, but symbioses are a little bit more broad than just positive relationships between two species. Symbiosis is any relationship in which individuals of two species live in close physical and or physiological contact with each other. So we've seen symbiosis before. We've seen symbiosis with parasitism, right? We talked about symbiosis back then and we said, parasitism is an example of symbiosis. So we may have symbiosis being a mutualism or a commensalism, and when we talked about those different symbionts that protect from parasites, right? That's good for us, right? That benefits us, and of course those symbionts that are living in us, protecting us, they also benefit by having sort of habitat. So in that case, we've got a mutualism going on. But down below in that second figure, that is malaria. In this case, it's still a symbiosis. Malaria is still living in close physical contact, in fact, in our cells. It's by definition a symbiosis, but it's not a good one for us. It's a good one for the malaria, and so that's parasitism. So again, the symbionts that are living in our body, protecting us from disease, those are mutualists. They're benefiting from us, we're benefiting from them. The symbionts that are living in us and hurting us, like malaria, those are parasitism, right? But they're both symbionts. They're both examples of symbioses. And we've seen both those examples in the previous lectures. All right. So another way we can sort of divide classes of mutualisms is whether they're obligate versus facultative. So an obligate mutualism is a mutualism where both parties require the other for survival, right? And so way back in one of the early lectures, we learned about yucca and yucca moths. And we said that yucca is only found where the yucca moths exist, or where the yucca moths can tolerate the environment. And yucca moths are only found where yucca can tolerate the environment, where the yucca can grow, because the two 100% need each other. No other insect will satisfy the yucca moth for pollination, and no other plant will satisfy the yucca moth for food. No other insect will satisfy the yucca other than the yucca moth for pollination, and no other no other plant provides food for the yucca moth. And it's actually food for the yucca moth larva. That's what that's the stage of the yucca moth that's using the yucca. So again, you can put all sorts of other plants in there and try and make the yucca moth lay their eggs in it and let their larvae live on it, but they can't. And you can put all sorts of other pollinators in the area and try and let them pollinate yucca, but they can't. And so this is an obligate interaction. And obligate interactions, obligate mutualisms are very common in restricting species ranges. Neither species can live without the other, so both species are subject to the environmental conditions that restrict each of the two different species. Different scenario with facultative mutualisms. With facultative mutualisms, both parties can benefit, but they are not required. So they don't need each other. And here I have a honeybee, trying to get some pollen and nectar out of an aster-like plant. Well, honeybees pollinate many, many different things, asters included. They'll pollinate asters, they'll pollinate blueberries, they'll pollinate almonds, they'll pollinate literally anything in your garden. And so that means the honeybee does not require asters for survival. It benefits from asters, it's getting some of the stuff it needs, but you could substitute that with any other plant and it'd be doing just fine. Not any other plant, but most other plants, and it'd be doing just fine. Same thing with the aster. Asters get pollinated by a lot of different insects, honeybees included, but if you removed all the honeybees, asters would be just fine without them. All right. Another different kind of way that we can think about mutualisms, we can think about what they're providing. So the two big classes of what are provided are food and shelter. So if the mutualism is providing food, we call that a trophic mutualism. Remember, trophic interactions are eating interactions. And so when the mutualist receives either energy or a particular nutrient, it's not necessarily energy, it could be nitrogen, phosphate, something it really needs, something limiting from its partner, we call that a trophic mutualism. And a good example is with legumes and the bacteria that live along their roots, the nodules. So the bacteria actually fix nitrogen and provide the plant with nitrogen, so that's a nutrient. And then the plants give those bacteria back photosynthetic products, carbohydrates, so that's basically energy. And so both of those are trophic mutualisms, but they're going in sort of opposite ways. You're getting nutrients going one direction and energy going the other direction, and so they're both benefiting. The other possible thing is shelter, and when that's the case, when the mutualist partners are providing shelter for the other, we call that habitat mutualism. So again, that's where one partner provides a place to live, shelter, a favorable habitat for the other. And this is an example we've talked about in a previous class. This is devil's gardens. And if you remember devil's gardens, these are huge areas in the rainforest that have a single plant species in them. And the reason they have a single plant species in them is because there's an ant species that really likes that plant, that lives in that plant, that makes its home in that plant. And so the ant species has a habitat mutualism with that plant because it lives in the structures provided by the plant. But the ant actually also provides habitat for the plant because what it does is it goes around and kills all the other plants in the area, injects formic acid into their stems and kills them, so it's actually providing a favorable habitat without competition for its favorite plant species. So again, this is a mutualism where both species are providing shelter or habitat for the other. The plant is providing habitat for the ants because the ants actually live in these tissues of the plant, in these structures made by the plant. And the plants are getting habitat because the ants are busy killing all the competitors in the area. They're making a really nice competition-free zone for the plant. All right, so why do we care about mutualisms? Well, mutualisms matter because they can actually affect all sorts of aspects of ecology. They can affect species abundances. So a good example is, again, with ants, because I love ants. This is actually an example from your textbook, but I like ants so much I decided to stick with it. Here we have pseudomyrmex ants, and they're living on acacia. And some researchers did experiments where they actually removed the ants from the acacia, and they found that the acacia did not grow nearly as well without the ants, because what the ants do is they protect the acacia from predation. And then they tried to grow these ants on other plants. Didn't work so well because the ants actually need the acacia to live on. They live in the thorns of the acacia. So again, the species abundance, whether that species is present or not, whether it can survive there, and how high the population gets, can depend on mutualisms. Species distributions can be determined by mutualisms. Remember, we said you'll never find yucca moths where you don't find yucca, and you'll never find yucca where you don't find yucca moths. So again, the distributions of these two species are tightly integrated. Even if the yucca could tolerate cold temperatures that the moth can't, it still can't grow there because there's no moths. Even if the moth can tolerate warm temperatures that the yucca can't, it still can't grow in that area, it still can't live in that area because it needs its mutualistic partner. So the species distributions are being affected. We can also have changes in community diversity if you disrupt mutualisms. So an example is cleaner fish in coral reefs that protect some of the other fish from parasites. And what they find is that if you actively remove these cleaner fish, the diversity of the reef community just plummets. Obviously, this cleaner fish is really playing an important role in allowing the diversity of the reef, allowing all these species to coexist. Not surprisingly then, what we find is that mutualisms can actually affect species interactions. They can change the balance, they can change the dynamics of competition, they can change the dynamics of predation just by being there and existing. And so this is an example where two different grasses, if you remove the mutualisms with their root fungi, you change from coexistence of the two grasses to one of the two grasses winning out just by removing that mutualism. So you're changing the relative competition between them by changing the fungi, the mutualistic fungi in their roots. So again, mutualisms matter. They change everything from species abundances and distributions to the entire community, and frequently they change the entire community by altering the species interactions in there, by altering sort of the competition and which species can coexist, and predation, and which species can support the other in terms of food or being preyed upon. The mutualisms really matter. All right, so that's our talk on competition and a little bit on mutualism. We didn't cover mutualism in as much depth just because we don't have time, but that's our sort of wrap up of species interactions. And in the next class, we will talk about epidemiology.